you everyone for joining us tonight as a part of the city's anti-racism plan to do more educational series, speaker series to learn about systems and policies that might have unintentionally contributed to racism in our country. This is a part of the series. We've done a talk on racial covenants, a talk on white supremacy, the KKK, the history of that. And now tonight, this is the third presentation that we put on through the library since the adoption of the anti-racism plan just in October. So thank you to our library director, Ann Hage, for putting this on for us, and city manager and Amy Sullivan for helping us promote the series, and to all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us to learn about zoning and what it has to do with our upcoming master plan and why this information might be helpful in helping us to together come up with a vision for a more welcoming and inclusive future together. It is my honor and privilege to introduce you tonight to Professor Carolyn Lowe. She is a professor at the Urban and Regional Planning Program at Wayne State University. Fun fact about Dr. Lowe, she was actually my graduate student advisor when I was in grad school at Urban Planning School at the other university in Ann Arbor. So she was kind enough to spend some time sharing the research that she's been doing with the Michigan Association of Michigan Planning Association, where she helped develop a equity tool to help planners and communities assess how well in what ways their communities are planning for equitable outcomes as they work towards these types of goals. And that was a tool that was recently developed, and we hope to maybe eventually use that as a part of our urban planning process as well. Dr. Lowe is going to spend some time tonight to provide an overview of the origins of zoning, the impact of single family zoning, and its impact on segregation as a whole. And then, we will have a little bit of time at the end to answer any questions that you have, but I think this conversation and this learning opportunity is so important for us because we have the master plan update that will be coming up very soon later this year. The master plan is updated every 5 years, and it's basically our vision and our roadmap to the future. And I will stop talking at this point and hopefully use the majority of our time today to hear from Dr. Lowe. And just one quick housekeeping. For security reasons, many of you know that we had a Zoom bomb situation earlier this year. So for that reason, that is why we have been muting participants in these types of forums. And if you do have a question, maybe save it towards the end of the hour. I will do my best to get to every one of them. If we don't have time for that, we can always follow up with you via email or another conversation. But if you do have questions, please type it into the chat to the admin. Thank you. Dr. Lowe.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you, Anne and Amy. Thank you all for inviting me tonight. I'm really happy to be here with you. This is one of the big benefits of Zoom, is that I can be with you from where I live, and nobody has to drive anywhere, so that's kind of nice. I'm going to share my screen with you because I have a few illustrations to show you. Maybe. Yep, here we go. And I have to get you back. Okay. So my talk tonight is going to be kind of a two-parter. First, I'm going to talk to you about the zoning, the history of zoning, what kind of the issues are with zoning. Then I'm going to shift to talking about planning and your plan in light of your upcoming planning update. So we're going to kind of start with zoning and then end with planning. So first of all, why do we regulate land use? Zoning is part of regulating land use. As many of you are on the Planning Commission, that's one of your jobs, is to come up with legislation that your city council then passes to regulate land use. There are really good reasons why we regulate land use. There are health and safety reasons. So we regulate land use to protect people from fire hazards, from disease, from pollution, to make sure that there's adequate light and air between buildings. We regulate land use for economic reasons. So it turns out that the free market really likes zoning because it gives them consistency, right? Like if you're a realtor or a property investor, you want zoning because you want to know what's going to be there in the future. You want predictability and consistency. And then we also want to zone because we want to limit exposure between incompatible uses. We don't want to put an elementary school next to a factory that puts out air pollution, for example, as a sort of an extreme example. So there are really good legitimate reasons to regulate land use. And we often use the tool zoning to do that. There are other ways to regulate land use also, but we're going to focus on zoning tonight. So modern zoning as a tool has been around since 1916. And that was when New York City adopted its first zoning ordinance. But we really have been regulating land use for hundreds of years. This is an illustration of the Great Fire of London in 1666. So anybody know anything about the Great Fire of London? It was devastating. At the time, buildings were made out of wood. They were packed very close together. Streets were very narrow. And so when fire started in one part of the city, it spread very, very quickly. So after the Great Fire, they passed an act for rebuilding London. And they specified what building materials you could use to build your house. They wanted people to build more out of brick and stone than wood. They specified street widths so that fire could not as easily jump across the street. They specified access to water to aid in firefighting. They relocated noxious uses outside the center of the city, and then they compensated landowners for the redevelopment that they were doing. So parts of London that we can still see today are the result of the rebuilding after this fire. And so that was one of the first major governmental large-scale interventions into land use arrangements. Later on in the 19th century, people started getting much more interested in public health. And one of the major facets of public health, of course, is disposal of waste. When you have a lot of people concentrated in one area, you have to make sure that you are carrying away the waste and keeping people healthy and safe. And so some of the most monumental public works that had ever been built were built and were sewers. So this is the larger picture is a sewer in London, and then the one down to the right is a sewer in New Jersey. So these were some monumental public works, and they really started giving people the idea that there was a role for government in providing infrastructure and arranging land uses. Also around this time, government started getting interested in parks and recreation planning, and this is a time when the Industrial Revolution is really heating up. Cities are becoming less pleasant places to live. They're very dense, they're very crowded, they're very polluted. And so there's interest in providing parks for people to get some exposure to fresh air. It was thought to be morally better for them to be exposed to nature. And so again, this is sort of like the precursors of zoning or thinking about land uses in these ways. So the zoning and building standards that we're familiar with today were largely in response to those conditions in the 19th and early 20th century industrial city. Just a couple of pictures to show you what that was like. So this is from the UK. So this is the kind of air pollution that people lived with on a daily basis. This is on the left, there's a picture of a kind of an alley in a lower class area. This is some famous photos by Jacob Riis from Manhattan in 1890 and 1889. So this is the way people were living who were working in factories. This is a group of people who are sharing one apartment, and they've kind of built an extra bed for themselves. So you can see that these cities were extremely, extremely overcrowded. Just another picture, a picture of Manchester. So the interest in regulating land use came out of some really terrible conditions. And there was clearly a need for mitigating some of the most egregious harms that were being caused by these land uses and this overcrowding. So Planning and Zoning Enabling Acts, the Standard Zoning Enabling Act was adopted in 1924, and the Standard Planning Enabling Act was adopted in 1927 by the US Department of Commerce. And subsequently, similar acts were adopted in most states. And what these do is they allow local governments to conduct planning and zoning activities and to regulate land use. So this is huge, right? So local governments can now take these laws into their own hands and figure out what they need in their communities. Well, not yet. So Michigan actually had adopted its own Zoning Enabling Act a few years earlier in 1921, but it was written by the same attorney as the US one. So it's basically very similar. And then the Municipal Planning Act was adopted in Michigan in 1931. So we've been zoning and planning for a long time in Michigan, just about 100 years actually, with the zoning. So what was the result of all this? Well, it broadly did succeed in reducing people's exposure to industrial pollution. It broadly did succeed in improving living conditions. And so in that way, zoning has been very successful. However, there are also some not so great consequences of the way zoning has been used by land use decision makers. And remember, zoning is a tool. It's a tool that does what you want it to do. So there are lots of different ways it can be used, and different people use it in different ways at different times. And so whenever we talk about what zoning does, we're really talking about what people do with zoning, what people use zoning to do. And that's something really important to keep in mind, is that land use decision makers, like the Planning Commission, and then you give recommendations to City Council, you have a lot of control over the way zoning is used in your city. So what are some of the consequences? We have often used zoning to separate uses that don't necessarily need to be separated. And we've created an environment where we often have to travel long distances by car in order to access the things we need on a daily basis. We have a lot of people who need to drive their kids to school. We have a lot of people who need to drive to the grocery store. We have a lot of people who need to drive to a doctor's appointment, drive to the library. All of the kind of daily needs are often only accessible by car in a lot of places. And the reason for that, the reason zoning is, the way we have zoned is responsible for that, is that we have large areas that are just one kind of land use. And so if you want to do something that's a different kind of land use, like you are in your house, you want to go to the store, it ends up being very far away. So you can see in this picture, it's a largely residential area for almost as far as you can see. So if you wanted to leave your house and go to the supermarket, it might take you a while in this picture. When I tell people I'm a planner, they always say, oh, we could really use some planning around here. and a lot of times what they mean is they have to drive a lot of places, and the traffic's really bad. And I'm always like, well, that's on purpose. Like, that is how it was planned. That is how it was zoned. That's not from a lack of planning. Those are the planning choices that were made where you live. So it's not that there wasn't planning there. It's that the kind of choices that the planners and land use decision makers made resulted in that landscape. So that's one issue that's been a consequence of the way we've used zoning. Another is that we've used zoning most often to protect the property rights of elites. So the kind of pinnacle of zoning is the single family house. And most zoning is set up ultimately to protect the property value of single family homes. That is like kind of really what mostly it's trying to accomplish. There are other things that they will do also, but really that's kind of the motivation behind it in a lot of cases. The original intent of zoning, based on the court case Euclid versus Ambler, was to protect single family residential property rights from infringement by industrial or multifamily uses. So that was the whole reasoning behind wanting to adopt that zoning ordinance. And the Euclid versus Ambler decision actually says that apartments are parasites that take advantage of the nicer environment provided by single family homes. So this is from the get-go that we're seeing protecting single family home property rights and residential housing values is kind of one of the main features of the zoning ordinance. Another issue that we see with the way zoning has been used is it's often used to, we often use zoning, multifamily zoning as a buffer to protect single family homes from busier streets. And I actually, I had that note and then I actually saw that in your own zoning ordinance. So I thought I would pull that up to show you. So that's often an explicit use of an explicit reason for citing multifamily houses where they are, is to protect single family houses from less desirable uses in busy streets. So we're kind of using zoning to use people as a buffer for other people. And when you put it like that, it doesn't sound great, right? So that's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight. But that is, you know, don't feel like you're the only ones to do that. That's a very, very common word to use. It's a very common land use arrangement to make, but it's something that we need to really think about more. Because when we put people next to noxious uses, if we put people next to a freeway, a busy street, an industrial area, we know that there are things, noise pollution, air pollution, that affect people in those units just as much as they would affect people in single family homes. So it's something we really need to pay attention to. And then finally, this is kind of why I'm here tonight, is that single family zoning has been the single most effective tool at creating exclusionary segregated neighborhoods and even entire cities. So if you look at, there's an important study that was done in 2000 about different growth control measures and their effect on the non-white population in the city. And so they looked at various different ways of limiting growth. And what they found was the growth control method that was most strongly associated with a lower percentage of minority residents was single family zoning. There were all these other measures that were explicitly designed to limit growth, but the one that really had the greatest effect was single family zoning. And as you probably know, when you had your discussion about restrictive covenants or racial covenants, single family zoning was used in conjunction with other tools explicitly to limit minorities' access to different cities. So things like redlining, this is a map that shows Detroit. This is from 1939, and it shows the neighborhoods in which banks would and would not lend money to people to either buy a house or fix up their house. So if you buy a house, say you buy a house and you need a new roof and you want to take out a loan, home equity loan to fix your roof, and they say, oh, I'm sorry, you live in a neighborhood that's a bad risk, we're not going to loan you any money, you're not able to keep up your house. Or to even to buy to get a mortgage to buy a house there in the first place. So that's not a zoning technique in itself, but it's something that was combined with a lot of single family zoning. Steering, you might have talked about steering, where realtors would show people from certain demographic groups certain houses in certain neighborhoods and not in others. And then, of course, restrictive covenants that you've talked about already. And then another thing that you might not have even thought about is parking minimums. Parking minimums actually do a lot to restrict the supply of multifamily housing because they just make it much more expensive and they require more land. So all of these things together, single family zoning, restrictive covenants, redlining, parking minimums, all of those things together have kept a lot of non-white people out of certain cities. And we've definitely seen that in the Detroit area for many years. And even when you're not doing any of these things intentionally, if the, even when the goal is not to reduce minority residents' access to a city, the thing that single family zoning does is it raises the price of entry to the city, right? So imagine that you want to buy a house in a particular city, and every lot is an acre. And they say, okay, you can buy a house in this city, but you have to be able to afford an acre lot. And you say, well, I'd like to go in with my friends. We'd like to split our acre, and I'd like to split it with them because then we can afford it if we go in together. And they say, no, I'm sorry. The minimum entry price here is a 1 acre lot. But if you split it with your friends, you could afford it. And so that's basically what multifamily housing does, is it lets people split it with their friends. They're not friends yet, but maybe they're friends when they move in. It basically lowers the price of entry into the city because it divides up the cost of occupying that land between more people. And so if you limit the density by creating an area that only has single family houses, you've raised the price. And so you are then limiting access to lower income people, and lower income people are not always minorities, and minority people are not always low income, but there is a great deal of overlap between those two groups. And so you end up limiting the availability of, limiting the access of non-white residents into the city if you have all single family zoning or a lot of single family zoning. So what has this left us? It's left us with, in many cases, the best school systems, the most convenient services, the best parks, the safest neighborhoods, and the best access to jobs, largely off limits to many, many people of color. And you've got people of color who are very persistent and brave and affluent, and they've made it into some of these cities, but it's not easy, and it's not the majority who can do what's required to get into these cities. So that is what single family zoning does for us, is it raises the cost of entry, it limits the housing types that we can provide, and it limits, in practice, it limits minority residents in the city. And I'll come back to this, but it also paradoxically has left some cities with a sort of housing monoculture. And so if you are not in a particular demographic, such as, a family with middle-aged parents and a couple of kids, the housing stock is not really appealing to you. And so that's starting to become a problem in some cities as their populations age. So we'll come back to that in a second. So what now? We've had 100 years of a zoning experiment, literally 100 years in Michigan. And we now know some stuff about it. We know how it works. We know what it does well, what it doesn't do well. who it has helped, who it has hurt. And it's really time to kind of re-examine how we do land use decision making, and how we can make our cities more welcoming, fairer, and more efficient. All of those things you can do at the same time, actually. And so not only is it the right thing to do, but it makes economic sense, because we know from planning research that cities with more diverse housing types tend to weather economic crises better. So if you've only got one product that you're selling and somehow people's needs change or people's ability to pay changes, that can be a real problem for the city. So where does the plan come in? The plan, as you guys all know, is the legal basis or background for your zoning ordinance. It's what kind of you could point to in court if you were ever sued about a zoning regulation to say, this comes from our plan. It also guides changes in the future, and it's the community's vision. Hopefully it's the community's consensus vision based on a good participation process that talks about what is going to happen in the city in the future. And so any changes to your zoning really need to start with your plan. And so that's why this kind of part 2 of this talk is about the plan. And this is something that I've been looking at really carefully over the past almost 2 years. I'm on the MAP, Michigan Association of Planning Social Equity Committee, and that committee, which is made up of practicing planners, said, we really want to understand what plans are doing in terms of equity or not doing. So like Michelle said, in concert with that committee, I developed a very, very long and detailed tool that's online. It's free. You can use it for people to evaluate their plans. And we found that plans could do a lot better than they're doing. But there are definitely some great examples out there that I would encourage you to look at when you start looking at your plan. I will make the slideshow available to Michelle. She can share it with you, and it's got the plan names on it that I'm pointing you to. So what are components of an equitable plan? How do we direct our cities toward equity and equitable land use decision making? First of all, is just be really explicit about it. Make equity an organizing principle. Talk about equity. You don't have to hide it. You can say that it's important. This is from the city of Bridgman, which is a very small coastal city on the west coast of Michigan. They had a really great plan. I would encourage anyone to look at it. They talk about equity. They talk about who's at risk in their community, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and how they're going to make sure that they take good care of everybody. Here's another example. Whoops. I think I missed a slide somehow. Another example, which I'll tell you, but I can't show you, is from Livingston County. Livingston County did a really good plan where they had a whole chapter on social equity. I'm sorry, I don't have that slide anymore. I don't know what happened to it. And so they really were explicit in saying, we want to make sure that our land use decisions are fair. We want to make sure that our land use decisions make the least well-off people in our communities better off. That's kind of their organizing principle. Does this make the most vulnerable people in our community better off or not? Have an inclusive process. So the one factor that we found helped explain the equity, the level of equity emphasis of the plan, was how many different types of public participation options they had. So they had a large public meeting, and they also had a survey, and they also had focus groups, and they also did social media. So if they added those different things on, it turned out to have a relationship with how equitable the plan was. So, I mean, that's just good planning anyway, because you want to make sure you really get everybody in your community involved. But you know, this is a situation where if you look at who came to your public meeting and you think, people from that neighborhood really weren't there, or we've got, let's say, a Vietnamese community, and we didn't really see anybody from the Vietnamese community. That's where you reach out to them, have a focus group, make sure that you've really involved everybody in your community. So that's kind of job one. You want to identify vulnerable people in vulnerable neighborhoods. And even in a community where, if you look at sort of the median household income, it's very high. If you look at education levels, they're very high. There may be people, or there may be kind of geographic pockets where people are struggling. And so this is a map from the Fenton Township Master Plan, and it's families in poverty. And so if you just look at Fenton Township's kind of overall statistics, they look really good. They look like people are doing okay there. But it turns out that there is a neighborhood where people are really struggling. And so knowing where to maybe redirect some resources to help people there is really important. And then the number one thing to do in a plan is to expand housing choice. So you want people to be able to find housing at a variety of price points, a variety of sizes, a variety of configurations. And that's true from an equity perspective, where you want people with different kinds of jobs, different kinds of backgrounds to be able to live in your city. But you also want people at different kinds of life stages and ages to live in your city, right? So not everybody needs a big single family house that's 2 stories tall. My mother is thinking of trying to leave her house, and she doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know whether to stay in her city or to leave, but she's 73 and she doesn't need a 3,000 square foot 2-story house anymore, but she doesn't want to leave her whole life. So making sure that there are places in the community where, when people are ready to move to a different type of housing unit, that kind of housing unit is there in their community. They can still go to their library. They can still go to the same place of worship. They can still serve on the same committees that they do now. They don't have to leave, but they do want a different kind of house. And then, of course, from the equity piece, having more multifamily housing, whether it's duplexes or fourplexes or townhouses or whatever the configuration is, it doesn't have to be super high density. It allows different housing choice. It allows different people to move into that community who otherwise would not. So remember, it lowers the price of entry. The tickets are less expensive, and so more people and more different kinds of people can afford them. It's very simple kind of division, right? And remember also that expanding housing choice doesn't necessarily mean fundamentally altering the character of a neighborhood. If you look at this picture, you see the detached single family houses, and then right next to them are duplexes and fourplexes. And in terms of how much of the lot they take up and how big they are, they're really not very different than the single family houses, right? So that would not fundamentally change the character of a single family neighborhood if you had a few of those tucked in. The other thing that doesn't change the character of a single family neighborhood is accessory dwelling units or laneway houses or garage apartments. Those, if you have a big enough lot, you can put some of those in the back and have a really different type of housing product that's available in the same neighborhood. So there are really creative ways and unobtrusive ways to kind of slide in some more density without really changing the way the neighborhood feels. And I know that people love Huntington Woods and they love how it is right now, and nobody wants it to be very different, right? Because it's beautiful and people love it. But there are also ways to be more inclusive without really fundamentally altering the way that the community feels. And so you kind of want to think about, like, what's the low-hanging fruit in a community like Huntington Woods? Where are the places that you could do some redevelopment and put in some different kinds of housing, maybe around the edges? And then in the neighborhoods, what are some ways where you could kind of, in a very incremental way, add in some density, add in some more choices? So that's the kind of thing that you want to be thinking about in your plan. Not that we're going to like blow everything up and change everything, but what can we do here and there, bit by bit, to make this community more welcoming, more inclusive? You want to link housing to transportation? No, I think sorry, I think my slides are out of order here. You want to take climate change and all their hazards into account. So this is again from the city of Bridgman. They have these great maps that show storm risk for kind of current versus like worst case scenario. And kind of overlaying that with demographics can show you, are certain people in certain demographic groups more at risk from these events than others. Here's a picture from Huntington Woods that I found. I think this was from 2014. Probably some of you know the person who took the photograph, who writes a blog, but this is urban flooding is one of the kind of big climate change issues that we deal with in our area. We don't have coastal flooding here, obviously, because we're inland. We don't have things like mudslides or we have to worry about steep slopes, but we do have urban flooding. And so looking at where are the vulnerabilities in the community, who are the people who are going to be affected by this more, it's often the case that lower income people live in lower lying areas because the higher income people have taken the best high ground for themselves. We saw that during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, for example. I'm not saying that's true in Huntington Woods, I have no idea, but it's something that you want to look at. Link housing to transportation. So if you are adding in different kinds of housing for people in different demographics or different ages, is that going to be accessible to the transportation network so that they can get to their jobs or get to the things that they need? So don't assume everybody has a car or wants a car. What are ways that we can link housing to all of the things that we need to do using public transportation to the extent that that's possible with the public transportation network we have? And I know it's not perfect. I know it could be better. And finally, thinking about the distribution of amenities, services, are those equitably distributed throughout the city? Are there people in certain neighborhoods who can't access things as well as people in other neighborhoods? I'm not making any judgments here. I'm just throwing up a picture of your zoning map. Just to think about it, because you know your city much better than I do. And then identify areas for redevelopment and be ready with a plan. So there are some areas that maybe the city controls, and those are ones that are really important to talk about from a redevelopment perspective, but maybe there are other areas that the city doesn't control that where you think it would be great to see some mixed use, some multifamily housing. And if those are areas that you can identify in the master plan, all the better. Then you have a plan, you have suggestions, you can even approach developers and suggest those things to them, you can provide incentives. So there are ways to create some leverage around land use changes that you want to see. So in conclusion, I want to leave some time for questions. It's totally appropriate and often beneficial to regulate land use and to use zoning. We've done it for a long time. There are many ways in which it's brought us benefits. But the way we have used zoning, and especially the way we use single family zoning, has definitely caused harm to people of color and low income people, both intentionally and unintentionally. And unfortunately, that harm is still going on now. So it's something that we really need to address. We know that changes don't happen overnight. The built environment is not something that you can just kind of crumple up and throw away when you want to change things. We know that change can be slow, but we need to not waste time. So we need to think about these things right now. So I think, this is a tremendous opportunity to, because we know so much about zoning now, we know how it works, we know what it does, we know what it doesn't do. So this is this huge opportunity that we have because we've had this 100-year zoning experiment. And I think it would be amazing if the next part of the story that we tell about zoning is how we use zoning to make our cities more inclusive instead of how zoning has been used to make cities exclusive. And I think that is something that we have every capability of doing. So that's what I want to leave you with tonight, is that yes, zoning can be problematic, but we have the power to make it this tool for inclusivity. So I'm excited to see what you guys end up doing with your plan. And then I can take questions. Thank you so much. Oh,
Thank you,
and
Dr.
sorry,
Lowe.
this is when you, I'm going to give this to Michelle, but this is the planning, the map equity committee page. It's got a link to both the tool that I mentioned and the paper that we wrote about it, and then some shorter newsletter type papers if you want to read any more about it. So I will leave that with Michelle, and you guys can check it out when you want to. Okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lowe. That was very helpful. And I apologize, my dog is wanting to sit on my lap, and that's just not going to work right now. So I just wanted to, I think, tie this back to our anti-racism plan, in that, you know, I often sometimes get the question, why is this even relevant to Huntington Woods? We're 99%, 98% built out. We don't have any land to develop, but we do. And in the last master plan, you know, the community identified Woodward Corridor and the municipal site and a couple of other sites for potential redevelopment. So we do have, I think, a responsibility to have a community conversation. Nothing's been decided yet. I think we need input. We need to go through the public planning process. And I'll share with you some of the key conversations that came out of the anti-racism plan group of, you know, people of color, including Black residents, that really gave us the opportunity to learn from their experience as a member of the community. And at the end of the day, working together for a more equitable system is good for everyone, because when we're talking about diversity, it's not just about race. I mean, it is race, absolutely, but it also includes age, disabilities, you know, other things that may have put certain populations, because of who they are, what they look like, where they came from, immigrants, you know, at a disadvantage because the system is inequitable. This isn't about targeting, you know, certain demographics. This is about making our community more equitable, because when it is more equitable, we all do better. So I think at the heart of it, we owe it to ourselves to examine and really understand how zoning has impacted us. And I think some of the examples that you showed tonight, I think that what you said was really beautiful, that we can still have what makes Huntington Woods beautiful and unique and what people love about it, but we can enhance it with more choices in housing. And I mean, from a business perspective, why this is important, this issue is so vital to our future, because our nation's demographics are changing. By 2045, half of the population will be minority white, is what they call it. And if, you know, we're still 95% white here, and that's a part of the history, and we understand, you know, racial covenants and the KKK and zoning and transportation and housing practices and mortgage practices and education. I mean, I can go on and on. Every single major policy has touched on why we are the way we are. And I'm not here to point fingers at anybody. This is an unintended consequence of the policy decisions that have happened over the last 200 years with the history of our society. So it is important to us because there's an economic benefit at the end of it too. Not only can we make it more equitable, but in terms of, you know, you showed Woodward Corridor with the transportation, public transportation. And can you maybe touch a little bit on the role of transit-oriented design in communities and placemaking and that density and how that can actually help improve the quality of private and public spaces. I see it as an opportunity to actually enhance our community with the benefit of being more inclusive. And along that line, I would love your opinion on inclusionary zoning. And if you think that that could be a potential zoning tool, to get very technical, because I think I've always felt that that could be a potential tool for this community that would be appropriate.
Yeah, so there, I guess, got a couple of questions. One is, what are some of the benefits of placemaking and transit-oriented developments? And there are many benefits in terms of the sort of competition to attract new residents to a place. Most people these days want a place that feels like a place. So some of the kind of more traditional post-war suburbs are losing out in some ways to places that have a more traditional downtown. So many people want to be able to walk to places, to be able to walk to a coffee shop or a store, to the library, or even walk to work. A lot of people are working at home, so they want to go out during the day when they're working at home, even before the pandemic, and I suspect it's going to be even more after. So they want places that are kind of integrated into their neighborhood, that are commercial spaces. And so I think the value in placemaking is such an overused word these days, but it means like, does it feel like there's a there? Are there places that you can go to and kind of, have these focal points and gathering places in the city? And then tying that into public transportation, again, when you have enough density to kind of focus that activity in a particular place, it often really helps. It's sort of a self-reinforcing thing to have that connected to public transportation. So, we have a very, very short streetcar in downtown Detroit now, but I know that the hope is that either the streetcar line will be extended or there will be some kind of bus rapid transit system with more fixed stops that operates more like a streetcar. And so I think having that idea of there being a focal point that's tied into public transportation could really be a huge asset for our city. And then what was your second question, Michelle? I'm sorry, I forgot. Oh, inclusionary zoning. So I have mixed feelings about inclusionary zoning, frankly. I think that higher density zoning and a variety of housing products at a variety of a variety of price points is sort of de facto inclusionary zoning. And it's relying on the market to sort of implement it for you. So inclusionary zoning can be things like incentivizing the addition of affordable units, and sometimes it can be a requirement to have affordable units. And I think that's fine, but I think most cities will not be able to meaningfully affect the housing supply in that way. So I think it's okay if you want to do that, but I think you also need a market-based strategy as well. So I just think the evidence is mixed on inclusionary zoning, but the evidence is very, very unambiguous that increasing the housing supply in general of market rate housing is a net positive for diversity and inclusion. So I think that if I were focusing my energy, I would say just make more units available at different price points and different sizes. And that's where I would really focus that, and let the market help you implement that, because in a community that has the great school system and the great quality of life that you do, there will be demand. So, any other questions?
Yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. I will also mention, while we see if there's any questions with the time that we have left with you, Dr. Lowe, we did spend pre-COVID, thank goodness, work with Dr. Larissa Larson at University of Michigan with a capstone project. Basically, the students were able to come in and do a lot of work in gathering community input on, aging in place and senior needs and senior lifestyles, because we do have a major population, as many places do right now with, what they call the silver tsunami, and making sure and thinking about inclusion, not right now only as race, but also as age and disability. And as we're thinking about having a conversation and learning about multifamily housing, what are some things that you think communities should think about in these types of, designs and conversations in their master plan specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of communities have a similar situation where they are desirable places for families to locate. And, a lot of people located there when they were raising their kids, and now they're kind of aging in place. And so the household sizes are smaller. And so the population of the cities are going down, even though all the houses are occupied, the number of housing units hasn't changed, but the population size is going down. And so if you've got this dynamic public school system and you want to keep up your school enrollments, it ends up being a problem. So I think one of the benefits of providing places, different types of housing units for seniors to move into when they're ready to move out of their big single family house, is that it helps you maintain that demographic strength that lets you keep up your school system. I mean, we've seen communities, Grosse Pointe's considering closing one of their schools. Farmington Hills has closed a school. So these are communities that are, considered to be very strong with strong school systems. And it's because of demographics. Their household sizes are going down. They don't have as many young families. Houses haven't turned over yet. And so their school systems are struggling. So we do see that. Yeah. There's a question in the chat. Has any city that you're aware of actually transformed a significant amount of single family housing into duplex, fourplex, et cetera, housing? This is a pretty new approach. It's only been in the last, 5 years or so that people have been really talking about this missing middle housing and kind of this conversation about kind of in situ densification in a single family neighborhood has really kind of come into the mainstream. So no, I think this is a new thing. The city that I'm aware of that has kind of put the most effort behind it is Minneapolis. They just eliminated single family zoning. So you should check out what happens there. But again, this is the built environment. These are buildings we're talking about. And so things don't change overnight, and no place will they. Somebody is in the chat asking, what if the goal is not only racial diversity, but economic justice? Isn't publicly subsidized housing the most direct path toward material uplift for overexploited peoples, especially Black and Brown? Hasn't the market disproportionately harmed communities of color in the US? I guess that's a complicated question. So the market, yes, has disproportionately harmed communities of color in the US, but I would argue that it's largely because the policy component of it and the land use regulatory component of it have been stacked against them. So I think by increasing the housing supply, by diversifying the housing products that are available, making sure that there's no discrimination in who's renting or who's buying is a really important way to start reversing that. So I think, publicly subsidized housing is fine, but there's only so much of that to go around, right? So we only have so much money to subsidize housing. but the market can give us a lot more. So again, I'm absolutely not against subsidized housing. I think is an important component, but it can never be the whole solution because we just can't afford it. So, and there's other ways that are more efficient to kind of allow the market to fill in that demand. Let's see. Another comment, we're pretty much built out, but at the height of the baby boom, there were 2,000 plus more people living in these houses. It's too bad not to leverage that space somehow. Yeah, so that's what I'm talking about is, you know, people who, like my mother, who's, you know, she's one person living in a 3,000 square foot house where a family of 4 people used to live. She doesn't live in Michigan, but if she could live in her neighborhood and move sort of down the street into a place that's 1 story, she doesn't want the laundry in the basement. She wants the laundry on the 1st floor, and she doesn't want to have to climb the stairs to go to her bedroom anymore. And she has a swimming pool, you know, doesn't want the swimming pool anymore. I see people like smiling and nodding. This sounds familiar, huh? But she doesn't want to leave her neighborhood. She loves her neighbors and she walks her dog and she sees all the people she knows. And so, you know, it's going to be a tough choice, and she may end up living in her house longer than she should. So, yeah, I think being able to allow some infill into places that could use it is a way of shoring up the city against future demographic changes or continued demographic changes. Yeah. Stephen, you can have the swimming pool. She does not want it. Yeah. Other questions or comments? So again, subsidized housing, absolutely, I'm a fan, but I think it's one part of a 2-pronged strategy. Has to be. Any other questions or comments?
I got one question that was sent to me, and I wanted to take this opportunity to answer it. I think it might be helpful to others as well. The question was about, you know, getting specific plans made about redevelopment of certain sites, like the municipal site, seems challenging. How do we get over the hurdles of planning and get the buildings built after the zoning is complete? I would say that maybe update the group. 2 years ago, we started the process with the redevelopment ready community certification with the state of Michigan. When I joined the commission in 2018, that was one of the priorities, and Amy Sullivan really worked hard on. They said it would take about 2 years, and here we are 2 years later, and we're 95% there. And what that program does is it makes sure that you basically, you know, think about when you're going to sell your house and you're getting ready for an open house. There are certain things that you've got to do in order to prepare for that. Red tape, process, staging, right? You want to put the best foot forward before you engage with the development community. So the state's program is very rigorous, and it puts you through this program. It has you looking at your zoning processes, your review processes, your communications, website, like all of these things that go into working with the development community. We need to get our ducks in a row first. So that's what we've been doing for the last 2 years. A critical part of that is the master plan update. And so that zoning, you know, to get there, we have to go through this process. And yes, there has been a ton of work done in the past on looking at housing for seniors, how do we age in place, and how do we redevelop the municipal site. We took all of that work into account when we worked with University of Michigan, and they, you know, reviewed all the data, the input and the feedback, and they built on it, they enhanced it. So it is still a part of that conversation, but now with the RRC program, after that certification, what it does for us is also it provides incentives to the development community while also making sure that the community has their ducks in a row before they go out to the market. I am so excited, but we were just approved for $30,000 of a grant match from the MEDC to support our master plan process. So in the past, we've just paid for it ourselves, but what that allows us to do is enhance the process. So, you know, more to come on that because we are just in the process. I don't know, Amy, if we did choose the urban planning firm recently. Did we? The city commission meeting? Or did I dream that? Well, we're in the process of getting all this together and getting our ducks in a row. And yes, it's not an overnight process. And unfortunately, I just, you know, coming into this, having worked at the state for 7 years before this, I just felt like that we needed to have these things taken care of and buttoned up before you put your house on the market, because you want the highest and best offer for the best quality redevelopment that we can, because this is an asset to all of us. We own, as taxpayers, we are the fiduciaries. I know many of you are on the planning commission tonight here listening to this, but we are all fiduciaries. We're neighbors, but we're all taking care of this together. And the land that we have is an asset, and frankly, is deteriorating. So we've got to come up with a plan. We do have an implementation plan. And as a part of the master plan process and the redevelopment ready certificate, out of that is also an economic development plan, implementation plan. So that will help address the question of how do we get this built? That's the next step. So I hope that answers your question. Any other questions?
I've got a couple more in the chat, Michelle.
Okay, why don't you pick like one or two more?
Okay, so I've got two more, and then we'll probably call it. So somebody says the Headley Act makes it so that taxes are capped in those houses that are not filled, that have an aging population. We're losing tax money because they're not turning over. Yes, that's true, and that's something that actually keeps people in their homes and makes them not want to leave, because they're afraid. I mean, they're not afraid, like they know that when they buy a new housing unit, their taxes are likely to go up, even if a housing unit that they buy is less expensive. So, I mean, that's a case for rental housing, actually, because if you sell your 3,000 square foot single family house and then you rent, then you're not having to worry about that big property tax bill again. So, you know, that's one consideration. And if you're thinking about what kind of housing products you might want. Another person said, we've heard about the possibility of senior housing being built in the City Hall area. How realistic is it that those apartments would be available for seniors living in Huntington Woods to get an apartment when the time is right for them? Or is it more likely that it will be filled by anyone? I'm assuming they can't provide preferential treatment just because you previously owned a home in Huntington Woods. No, you could not. And, you know, I, as a matter of course, would prefer to have housing units be sort of flexible in terms of who lives there, because it's hard for us to anticipate exactly who's going to want what when, right? I think I prefer sort of flexibility in buildings, and I prefer flexibility in housing. And so if you end up building rental apartments and it turns out that a whole bunch of young families want to move into those rental apartments because they're less expensive and they only have one kid and they're excited to get into the city, and then maybe they're going to look for a house and buy a house, then maybe that's what you needed. If you provide apartments that have the amenities that seniors want and the layouts and the features that seniors want, you could of course never guarantee that people who are already living in Huntington Woods would be able to move into them. But again, you've diversified your housing supply. And so whoever ends up needing those, at least there will be some of them available. I understand you guys have one duplex in the whole city, and that's your one multifamily housing unit, right? So I think there's room to grow here. I think you can do it. So. I have one more question. I have one more question, Michelle, and then we got to.
Okay. Okay. But real quick, Carolyn, just an update. You know, there was a lot of focus at one point about age-restricted housing, but to your point, exactly what you just said, and in the spirit of anti-racism and inclusive zoning, or not inclusionary zoning, but, you know, inclusive housing approach, we did make a decision at the city commission level to, at this point, entertain multiple options because we wanted the broader community input and looking at different types of housing options, we felt that this juncture in time, it was the perfect time and also more inclusive and the right approach to be able to get a more inclusive, input and choices, basically.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think trying to guess, what the market is going to want or do, I think is hard. And I also think throwing that option open to the greatest number of people is the more equitable thing to do too. So I agree. The last question I have here is part of your plan the ability to accurately obtain a mathematically valid sample of the population and not just who shows up to meeting or makes the most noise? Absolutely. And that's why you have to have those different methods of public participation. We know that in public participation, older people and white people are in general very overrepresented because people who are retired have more time, frankly. I mean, I'm not putting my kids to bed right now and I'm happy to be here, but if somebody asked me to be on the planning commission or to go to a meeting, I'd have to really think hard about it because, I teach one night a week and I got stuff to do, right? So, but if I were in my 60s and my kids are gone, I probably would have more time and I would, that's a way of giving back and it's wonderful, but it also means that there are people who tend to be less represented. People who work more than one job, people who have young kids, people who are single parents, right? Like those are people who we know don't end up getting heard in these kind of forums. So that's where the sort of focus group comes in. You can actually, call people on the phone. If there's some sort of organization that a bunch of people who are part of an underrepresented group in your process belong to, you can go and show up at their meeting, go to their book club, go to their knitting circle, whatever. You can meet people where they're at. So I think it takes some creativity. It takes a little extra effort than just having a meeting, but I think you really can get a representative set of voices in the city rather than just kind of the usual suspects. And by sampling, I mean using statistically valid methods. I think that is an approach that would probably be beyond most planning commissions, but you could try it. But I think kind of the sort of more human approach of going around to different places and reaching people in different ways is okay too. Okay.
Okay, so we are at the end of the hour, and if there are no other questions, I would just like to again thank everyone for taking the time out of your day to spend with us to talk about zoning, the most exciting subject in the world.
It is.
So I really look forward to having more conversations about this in the near future. As we get ourselves organized and hopefully things get better with COVID and we can do more input, maybe outdoors, or I don't know. I'll leave that up to Amy and Hank to figure out. But thank you all so very much. And Dr. Lowe, I appreciate all the time you spent preparing and educating us tonight. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to see what you do with your plan. I think this series is a great idea and I really applaud you for tackling these tough questions. So I think you have a really major opportunity here and I'm excited. So.
All right. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Have a good evening.